Your Art Unlocked is produced by Art UK, the online home of the UK's National Art Collection. This podcast is supported by Bloomberg Connects, the free arts and culture platform that provides access to over 1,300 museums, galleries, and cultural spaces around the world. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
The objects we're looking at today are pretty unusual. They were made in the late 19th century using glass plates, powders, and coloured pastes. And the secret ingredient? The human voice. So, what does the human voice look like?
This piece is completely blue. The background has horizontal stripes as if there are brush marks going across. And then there's a circular shape and then something almost protruding out of the plane of the image.
It reminds me of mould, but also it's quite a lot of movement here, so it's like roots of a tree or something.
Reminds me of dried plants that you would see in a herbarium and going through the process of sun dyeing, but with a beige background instead of brown.
This one reminds me of limpets on rocks, but fossilised.
It has a black background and then with kind of bronzy brown impressions on top that remind me of sunflowers, as if someone's dipped the heads of sunflowers in paint and splodged them on this black background. I really like this one. I think it has a lot of energy to it, like these sunbursts or starbursts across the plane of the piece.
These voice figures, or voice flowers, were made by Megan Watts Hughes, a Victorian singer and scientist from Wales, at a time when scientists were getting excited over new sound recording technologies, like the phonograph and the gramophone. But Margaret wasn't just interested in recording sound. She wanted to know what it looked like, and invented a machine to help capture the patterns, vibrations, and resonances of her own voice. Her voice figures appear as swirling, blooming patterns on glass plates. The novelist Emily Barrington described them as such things as Alice in Wonderland might have come upon had she tumbled down to the bottom of the sea. Is this art or science? How are they made? And what questions do they invite about the connection between sound, voice, and the natural world? I'm Steph Roberts, and in this episode of Your Art Unlocked, a podcast that brings to life some of the more unexpected objects in museum collections, we're going to the industrial heart of the South Wales Valleys, to Cyfarthfa Castle Museum and Art Gallery in Merthyr Tydfil, to unlock the stories behind the voice figures by Megan Watts Hughes. This is your art in your museums and galleries, so let's get to know it a little better. Now, we know this is a podcast, so if you want to look at the series for yourself as you listen, head to Art UK and search for voice figure. And a quick note before we start, Margaret actually went by two names. Margaret was the name she used for her published work, but it's an anglicised version of her Welsh name, Megan. Accounts of her life seem to flip-flop between the two, and because I love a bilingual quirk, I'll do the same. So let's dive in. Megan was born in Dowlais, near Merthyr Tydfil, in February 1847. And actually, that date didn't surprise me, because she gives off some serious Aquarius vibes. She became a singer, a composer, and a scientist, the first woman to present her own invention at the Royal Society Salon. She published books about her invention and was called the lady who sings flower forms onto flat surfaces. She was religious and had a keen social conscience. She turned her home in London into an orphanage, with the voice figures propped against the windows like some surreal underwater stained glass. If that doesn't give Aquarius, I don't know what does. Her artworks were overlooked for decades, but that's starting to change and people are getting excited again.
When I first saw Megan Watts Hughes' voice figures, I was really quite blown away, to be honest.
This is environmental sound artist Cheryl Beer.
Because, first of all, it's a woman, scientist, artist, in the 19th century when women were viewed differently to how they are today. It was a man's world, it was a patriarchal world, and she had her voice heard through visual sound. And when I saw the voice figures, I was really shocked at how similar they are to the sort of graphics that spectral frequency reveals through modern day technology all these years later. So she really was a visionary. And I also felt a really deep connection because here in the silence of her voice figures, her work still has a very clear voice and is being heard.
They really are incredible pieces, and especially because they are the only record of her voice to exist. The voice figures are held at Cyfarthfa Castle Museum and Art Gallery in Megan's hometown of Merthyr Tydfil. Here's Michelle Lewis, curatorial officer at Cyfarthfa, to tell us more.
The Voice Figures collection is a remarkable group of around 56 experimental works that were created by Margaret Watts Hughes in the 1880s and 1890s when she was developing and demonstrating an invention of her own creation that was called the idophone. Each voice figure is essentially a visual record of the human voice, of Margaret's own voice. Many of them resemble flowers, ferns, trees, and other geometric forms that she called her voice figures. In terms of appearance, the images are on glass plates, mostly on transparent glass, but some are also on opaque glass. Some are rectangular in shape, some are square, and we do also have a few examples that are round. They're around 2 to 4 millimeters thick. They're quite light and they're extremely fragile.
The voice figures entered Cyfarthfa's collection in 3 sets. The first set was acquired in 1931, around 25 years after Margaret died.
In 1931, Cyfarthfa Castle Museum and Art Gallery's curator Charles Holder learnt that the Science Museum in Kensington held a group of the voice figures deposited there in 1896. When he inquired about borrowing them, the Science Museum stated that they had been in storage for decades and that they aroused little interest, and they decided to give them outright to Cyfarthfa, believing that they didn't fit particularly well with the rest of the Science Museum collections.
You can find out more about Cyfarthfa Castle Museum and Art Gallery and hundreds of other collections on Bloomberg Connects, the free arts and culture platform. Download the app today.
It feels right that the voice figures have found their way back to Merthyr Tydfil. When Megan was growing up, Merthyr was the iron capital of the world, a global powerhouse forged on heavy industry and social unrest, where extreme poverty sat next to extreme wealth, and workers fought fiercely for their rights. Among all this turmoil was a strong sense of solidarity and mutual support. This community spirit helped Megan along her musical path. As a young girl, she sang in the choirs and chapels of Dowlais, at concerts in Merthyr and Aberdare, and competed at Eisteddfodau, which are festivals celebrating Welsh music, poetry and the arts. It wasn't long before her amazing vocal talent was noticed, and a local committee was formed to raise money to pay for her singing lessons in Cardiff. Megan eventually moved to London to continue her musical career. There, she was introduced to the work of scientists like John Tyndall, an Irish physicist who was popularising research into the nature of sound, waves, and vibrations. She began experimenting with the vibrations of her own voice, and this led to a surprising invention, the idophone.
My name's Rob Mullender Ross. I am an artist working principally in sound and a teacher and a sometime researcher.
Rob has been researching the voice figures for many years.
Margaret Watts Hughes was a pretty successful singer in her day. She was principally an exponent of what you might call light classical or popular song operettas. Also spiritual songs as well. She was deeply religious. According to her own account, the idophone was developed while she was attempting to measure the power of her voice. So she conceived of an apparatus which was effectively a receiving chamber, like a metal cylinder with a tube coming out the side, a little bit like a saucepan. And across the top of this main cylinder was arranged a rubber membrane. I think gutta percha rubber was used at the time. Then she would sprinkle powders or spores, lycopodium spores, that kind of thing on top. And she would sing into this to try and work out how powerful her voice is by how far these things leapt off of the membrane. Then one day she discovered that if she hit a certain note at a certain volume, these patterns began to form on the surface of the rubber. So this immediately caught her attention, and she discovered by an awful lot of practice and development that she could, using her vocal skills, create different patterns by using different pitches and different timbres of her voice. Then she moved on to different types of fluids and pastes and variations on that. And she discovered that by singing certain notes and certain timbres, again, she could really manipulate these materials on the surface of this rubber membrane to create flower shapes. And then using vocal dynamics, effectively excite these fluids into the shapes that she wanted. So she hit upon the idea of trying to fix these, or record them, so to speak. So she would sing this flower shape into existence and then place a glass plate on top and get a kind of imprint of this pigmented paste.
We don't know exactly what materials Megan used in her flower paste experiments. And because of this, and because the glass plates are so fragile, her voice figures are a bit of a challenge for curators and conservators today. Back to Michelle at Cyfarthfa.
One of the questions that we often get asked is why the voice figures are not on display. And this comes down to the fact that they are incredibly fragile and damage very easily. Some of this comes down to how they were created. The surfaces were never sealed or fixed, so even the slightest friction or movement can damage them, and changes in the environment can also disturb the painted surface. That's why, for now, the safest way for people to experience them is digitally. But there is good news. Cyfarthfa has initiated a conservation and research project to change that. Thanks to funding from a Museum Fundamentals grant, which is supported by the Julia Rousing Trust and the Pilgrim Trust, we've been able to bring in 2 specialist conservators, Sarah Peake, a specialist in glass, and Jenny Williamson, who specialises in painting conservation. So they're carrying out detailed condition assessments and taking tiny paint samples from the voice figures to analyse the materials that we used on the paint surfaces. So we're hoping that all of that work will feed into a conservation plan and will give us a clear path then towards safer handling and preservation, and eventually allowing us to bring them back out on public display.
I can't wait to see them on display. They really are stunning objects. When viewed in a light box, the colours, the olive greens, vibrant blues and burnt umber glow, making them look almost supernatural. Megan was deeply spiritual and believed her voice figures might give us a tiny glimpse into the divine mysteries of nature. She wrote, "The hope has come to me that these humble experiments may afford some suggestions in regard to nature's production of her own beautiful forms, and may thereby aid in the revelation of another link in the great chain of the organised universe." This combination of art, science and spirituality is perhaps why her voice figures have been overlooked for such a long time, and of course the fact that they were made by a woman. Although initially they generated some excitement in the scientific establishment, after a while nobody knew quite what to make of them, and the art world didn't have a place for her either. Here's Rob Mullender Ross again.
She wasn't taken seriously by the art world. In many respects, I think this is because they didn't really get what they were looking at, or somehow her work was seen as decorative. The closest thing to this kind of work being produced at the time was, interestingly enough, being produced by other women, figures such as Georgiana Horton or latterly Hilma af Klint. Notably, I think these works were all also very spiritually motivated. And here I think we hit upon why Watts Hughes should be more well known and her importance. Because when we consider her work with respect to these other female artists like Horton, like af Klint and like Emma Kuntz, for example, we can see that she was one of the pioneers of abstraction.
Today, more and more artists are exploring the visualization of sound, not just as an exercise in abstraction, but to delve deeper into contemporary concerns. Composer and environmental sound artist Cheryl Beer, who we heard from earlier, works with hearing aid technology to explore the sound of fragile ecologies.
I began exploring the visualization of sound sometime after I'd experienced sudden hearing loss, chronic tinnitus and hyperacusis, which is a sound sensitivity. I'd been a musician all my life. It was my full-time career. And I couldn't be that anymore. I couldn't be the same as I was because music had now become quite painful. And I was very immersed in nature and the healing of nature during that time. And I began to think about how I might notate music from the patterns within nature and started to repurpose hearing aid technology, spectral frequency used in hearing aid tests, to do that. I felt as though my work was a conduit that enabled and empowered nature, a voice of its own, that I was collaborating with nature instead of interpreting it.
While Megan Watts Hughes used her voice to create patterns and shapes that mimic the natural world, ferns, flowers and tree patterns, Cheryl's work takes a crucially different approach by de-centering the human voice.
In all of the conversations about the climate crisis, about how we should treat nature, there is one voice missing. There is one stakeholder who is never around the table. Lots of politicians and people with power sit around a table indoors talking about how to manage nature. And so sound art, ecological sound art, is a way of us empowering a voice of nature, putting nature's voice centre stage, which is kind of my mantra at the core of my work, that we enable nature a voice as an equal stakeholder in planet Earth.
It's tempting to wonder what Megan Watts Hughes would have made of the possibilities of sound art and digital technologies in relation to nature and ecological concerns today. We'll never really know. But her voice figures, perhaps, suggest to us alternative ways of tuning in to voices, sounds and stories that would otherwise be left unheard.
Your Art Unlocked is produced by Art UK, the online home of the UK's national art collection, supported by Bloomberg Connects. Explore more art at artuk.org.